Israel's economy has shrunk deeply. That should be no surprise since it not only was suffering from the genocidal war in the Gaza Strip, but other illegal aggressions, in particular against Iran. Given Israel's war footing, there seems to be no end in sight in its military escapades, which all comes at a cost for Israeli citizens. Israel's aggression against Iran came at a very heavy cost for the regime, not only posing as a threat to its very existence due to Iran's retaliation, but also an economic cost that dragged down Israel's economic output and productivity. Coming up in today's program, Israel's major economic hit. The Iranian retaliation against the Israeli regime not only incurred physical damage like to infrastructure, but also shed many percentage points off its GDP. Costly aggression against Iran. The Israeli regime not only underestimated the power of Iran's retaliation, but Israel's efforts to intercept the incoming missiles came at a great cost. Israel's dire economic future. The Israeli regime's war footing is bleeding its economy and coffers dry of funds, with no end in sight due to Israel's expansionist policies. We're going to be discussing those points and a whole lot more with Chima Sanchez, director of the channel Anti-Imperialistas, and also Christian Nader, political analyst and historian.
Thank you for inviting me to the media of Iran. That is one of our motherlands of the humanity. Any economist could better explain the difference between GDP and the real economy. They are not the same thing at all. But what is clear is that the state and economic situation of Israel are not sustainable. It's like a zombie economy, a dead economy walking. I can only tell you that the Zionist economy is only sustainable thanks to the network of the empire, and that the worst is just to come, because any Israeli company abroad will suffer the stigma of this genocidal crime. And by the way, the Western Empire is falling and its economy is bankrupt. Sooner or later, they will let Europe fall. The empire will let Europe fall, and soon after, the Israeli entity itself. Israel is being kept alive fictitiously by the direct transfers from the US and Europe. But there are more impossible economic data. Just yesterday, the Israeli parliament approved a budget spending increase of almost 10%, an additional $10 billion, which obviously cannot come from increased revenue in a decaying economy, but rather from the printing press of dollars. The daily expenditure on the war, both direct and indirect, $300 million daily, $100 billion a year, equivalent to its entire annual budget, and for an entity as small in population.
The Israeli economy had seen a downturn ever since the regime of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu launched a genocidal war on Gaza. One example, business shutdowns. 46,000 businesses have shut down since October the 7th. Construction, agriculture, and services sectors are hit the hardest. Many businesses have struggled to stay afloat, with many hurt by a high interest rate environment, more expensive financing costs, a shortage of manpower, a sharp decline in turnover and operations, logistic and supply disruptions, and insufficient government assistance.
The war with Iran is not sustainable at all if it were just Israel alone. But in reality, Israel acts as a proxy for the imperialist collective West, with the US government as the mafia boss. And this is why the war will be sustained until it is completely lost by Israel, because it is Zionism's way of delaying its final decline, collapse. Iran must be prepared for a new attack of Israel if the global context of the empire's war against the anti-imperialist axis doesn't change. Although it is true that Iran is not alone, the anti-imperialist axis of China, Russia, Korea, etc. will be ready to defend Iran before it can lose and fall in a confrontation for survival. Because everyone depends on everyone else at this moment. The war is global and all the fronts are connected.
This is the social section of the program. Israel's Gaza war spiked its budget deficit from 4.2% to 8.5% of the GDP, with $160 billion budget strained by $32 billion in war costs. 152,000 citizens left since October 2023. U.S. aid of $22 billion a year props it up. Without it, collapse looms. Netanyahu's 12-day war, how Iran exposed Israel's invincibility myth. Iran's precision strikes hit more than 18 critical targets, crushing Israel's military, economy, and tech sectors. The damage staggering. Israeli finance minister, the budget deficit has reached 134 billion shekels, around $36 billion, making it very difficult for us to continue this war. All the money we received from the United States has been spent in just a few days of war with Iran. According to Bank of Israel, the overall economic war against Iran is costing Israel $1 billion per day. Israeli side cannot sustain a long war against Iran. Gaza and Lebanon wars already cost $85 billion, which is 16.5% of Israel's GDP. Direct damage from the 12-day war with Iran has reached $3 billion, and that's before factoring in the cost of replenishing missile stockpiles and air defenses. Finance Minister Smotrich says the total war cost could hit $12 billion when $1.5 billion earmarked for business and civilian sector compensation. For nearly 2 weeks, Israel's economy was effectively shut down. The schools and non-critical businesses closed nationwide.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you. And greetings from Mexico. Un saludo desde México. First of all, we need to understand that Zionist economy is not self-sufficient. It's an enclave, not just a military enclave of Western imperialism, but also an economic enclave of Western corporations, mainly American and Western Europeans. It depends totally of raw materials and imports, finished products from these markets, mainly American. It's a bubble economy. If the ports or even the airspace are closed, all these products can come to occupied Palestine. There's also a myth that the Zionist entity produce the things they eat and they consume. That's totally fake. More or less, the food that they produce, it's around 10%. The rest of the 90% comes from Western Europe and America. Even the oil, for example, comes from Azerbaijan, and even the hardware digital technology comes from India. So in the moment that they become a war economy, they're totally dependent of their allies. Right now, the ports in the Red Sea and also the Mediterranean are neither importing all the products that before they were entering Palestine. So right now there is a huge problem for the Zionist economy, that it's totally dependent of Washington, of London, of Paris, and even New Delhi. Their allies, they don't trust this place to make investments. So there are, like, how can I say, a parasite economy depending of Western powers. Since 1948, the Zionist economy has been a very minimal economy that depends totally of Western products and Western markets.
Disillusioned with Netanyahu and the war in Gaza, Israelis are fleeing in masses, leading to a brain drain. In total, up to 1 million Israelis have left since October 2023. In 2024, more than 82,000 Israelis left the occupied territories.
Every time Benjamin Milakowski, alias Benjamin Netanyahu, gives a speech in English, he's talking to American Jews, not necessarily Zionists, but he's trying to convince American Zionists or Jewish people to migrate to occupied Palestine, to, for example, the West Bank or Gaza, not just because they need a demographic height, also because they need investments, mainly American investments. Right now, there have been possibility to bring more people to occupied Palestine, because these people mainly are against Zionism, but also they fear that the war can reach them, for example, in the West Bank. So what is happening in the occupied Palestine is that there are no more investments in the strategic sectors of the Zionist economy: weapons, digital technology used, for example, for war, for espionage, etc., and agriculture and chemical. Zionism can't stand many war fronts against, not just against Palestine, the resistance, but also against Iran, against Hezbollah in Lebanon, etc. They need their American godfathers to intervene directly against Iran, because, as I already said, Zionism is an enclave, but also a war laboratory that depends totally, not just in the economy, but also in the military of their American allies and the Western European allies.
This is the info news section of the program. China's Belt and Road, effective mechanism to promote yuan and unlock new markets. China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, is reshaping global economics, not just by building infrastructure, but by boosting the Chinese national currency and opening up fresh markets across Asia and beyond. U.S. military maneuvers. Brazilian government sees the recent American military maneuvers in Caribbean as preparations for an eventual American military intervention in Venezuela. Government officials are monitoring with concern the deployment of U.S. military vessels to an area near the Venezuelan coast. While they believe the current focus is on Nicolas Maduro's regime, they emphasize that Venezuela shares a border with Brazil of over 2,000 kilometers. U.S. unemployment. Nearly 2 million Americans on unemployment, highest since the pandemic era. Continuing claims for unemployment benefits jumped to 1.97 million in late July, according to a Labor Department report highlighting a weakening labor market. U.S. in Rwanda. U.S. companies rushed into Congo before ink is dry on peace deal. If pact between DRC and Rwanda is all about a resource grab for Washington, it will fail. Someone needs to do the hard work of diplomacy. This is the in-depth section of the program. When it comes to the impact of Israel's aggression against Iran, the damages to the Israeli regime continues to surface. A severe hit to Israel's GDP is the last thing that the Israeli regime needs. Its citizens are tired, but unfortunately for them, these wars will continue. Let's look at the severity of the damage from Iran's retaliation. The Iranian retaliation against the regime resulted in Israel's economy, its GDP, slumping 3.5% because of Iranian missile attacks that squeezed consumer spending and businesses. Israel's economy suffered its first contraction since outbreak of the genocidal war in October 2023, as private consumption, investments, and exports fell, given massive reservist call-up and business closures. The decline marks the first 3 months tumble since the last quarter of 2023, when the economy plunged 20.8% as the outbreak of the war with the Hamas resistance group took a heavy toll on consumer spending, trade, and investment. Now let's bring our guest, Chima Sanchez, director of the Channel of Anti-Imperialistas. Chima, my question, let's talk about the Yemenis' role here. Compounding the damage, Yemeni army attacks in the Red Sea have crippled Eilat's port. Now they are operating at just 3% of their capacity, furthering the strain that was already there on the Israeli economy. Doesn't this impact imports and exports to the occupied territories, which would put a much further strain on the Israeli economy? Can Israelis hope for a recovery of their economy?
Regarding the resistance to the significant impact of the closure of the port of Eilat, it is true. It's a real impact, of course. But the Western imperialists are once again saving Israel from the outside by using Cyprus ports and Turkey ports as suppliers of reliable goods to overcome the added problem of the interrupted passage from the Red Sea. Therefore, responsibility for the genocide lies not only with Israel, but with all the collaborators and partner states of the empire and Zionism that permanently support it. And not because of direct profit from Israel, but because of a return to global imperialist conquests. Zionism is a structured entity based on genocide and occupation, and it lives and survives on that. And its economy is sustained by selling its successes to countries that need its experience of practices of terror and slaughter as well.
But things did not look good for the Israeli economy even before the Israeli aggression against Iran. Much of the slide in GDP growth in the April to June period stemmed from a drop in business sector output, which plunged 6.2%, the Statistics Bureau said. Consumer spending fell 4.1%, and exports of goods and services, excluding startups and diamonds, decreased by 3.5%. So when it comes down to it, this is what we are looking at in a snapshot, which brings us to another very important point here, that Israel's economic lifeline has been outside support, mainly from the U.S., Israel's lifeline. U.S. aid to Israel has been a staggering $310 billion, inflation adjusted. Deficits are exploding, business shuttering, a startup entity living on foreign cash. After 77 years, is still no independence. That's the reality. Now, let's bring our other guest, Christian Nader, political analyst and historian. Christian, my question is about the Yemenis' role here. With the strain that the Yemen is putting on the Israeli economy and the Eilat port only working with 3% of its capacity, is there any hope for Israelis to see any kind of recovery of their economy?
Of course, what's the importance of the port of Eilat in the south of occupied Palestine in the Red Sea? All the products, raw materials and finished products, mainly hardware and digital products that come from India or from the East Asian markets that come by sea, their only entrance to occupied Palestine by the Zionist entity is through the port of Eilat. But it's not just the port of Eilat, it's also the northern ports in the Mediterranean, the ports of Haifa. Haifa was one of the main targets of the legitimate response in the last 2 months of the Islamic Republic of Iran against the Zionist entity. For example, all oil, the oil and gas that come from northern Africa come directly by the Mediterranean ports. Right now, what the Zionist entity is doing is all the products arrive to Cyprus or to Greece, and from there go to other ports, not as important as Haifa, but that's the only way for these raw materials and imports to get inside the occupied Palestine. I say it again, it's an enclave, an economical enclave, and also military of Western imperialism, but also of multinational corporations based in Europe or in America. And right now, the Zionist entity is alone. And Iran and Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanese soil know perfectly this. In many cases, the economical weapon it's better than the military weapon.
As you noticed, especially in some of the social media posts, Israel's economy is surviving through its powerful allies, especially the US. In terms of economic activity, the regime does not have one it can speak of. It is shunned all over the world due to its genocidal campaign against Palestinians, restricting its limited trade activities, and as it continues with its warmongering, it will lose any remaining allies. Thank you for joining us in another edition of this program. See you next week.